From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
There is no force in the world more powerful than the example of America. And that is why I have ordered the closing of the detention center at Guantanamo Bay and will seek swift and certain justice for captured terrorists. Because living our values doesn't make us weaker, it makes us safer, and it makes us stronger.
3.5 years after President Obama vowed to close Guantanamo, 169 men remain imprisoned there. Now the Supreme Court is refusing to hear any new Guantanamo appeals, even though half the men being held were cleared for release 5 years ago. Then new questions emerge over Mitt Romney's record on LGBT issues.
Marriage is a relationship between one man and one woman.
Just weeks after Romney refused to endorse same-sex marriage, the Boston Globe reveals the former Massachusetts governor's administration once blocked the publication of an anti-bullying report for teenagers because it contained the words bisexual and transgender. Then homelessness reaches a record high in New York. 43,000 people, including 17,000 children, are now living in the city's shelter system.
I do see homeless people out here in the streets, and I think to myself, I wonder, I hope that's not going to be me and my daughter in the next month or so.
Despite the record number of homeless people in New York, the Bloomberg administration has cut a crucial subsidy to keep formerly homeless residents in their homes. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. New figures show the recession brought on by the 2007 financial crisis has wiped out 2 decades of wealth for the average U.S. household. According to the Federal Reserve, the median U.S. family's net worth declined nearly 40% by 2010 to $77,300, roughly the same level it was in '92. Middle-income families saw the largest decline in wealth. The collapse of the housing market played a key role, with some home values dropping 42% between 2007 and 2010. The UN's warning of new dangers to Syrian civilians as the regime of President Bashar al-Assad escalates attacks on embattled areas and Syrian rebels target government forces and infrastructure. UN observers have witnessed Syrian forces attacking towns with a new display of air power, as well as Syrian rebels intensifying operations against government targets. A spokesperson for the UN observer mission in Syria said civilians are increasingly trapped in the crossfire.
They reported the use of heavy artillery and mortar shellings, as well as firing from helicopters, machine guns, and small arms. In Talbise, also UN observers reported that the Free Syrian Army captured soldiers from the Syrian army. The impact of the heavy artillery shelling and machine gun firing was also heard and seen from over Khaldiya in the city center. UNSMIS also received reports that a large number of civilians are trapped inside the town, and we're trying to mediate their evacuation to a safe place.
The UN has demanded immediate access to a number of areas amidst heavy clashes between rebels and Syrian troops. A spokesperson for Special Envoy Kofi Annan said civilians in Rafah are particularly at risk.
Mr. Annan is particularly worried about the recent shelling in Homs, as well as reports of the use of mortar, helicopters and tanks in the town of Al-Hafa in Latakia. There are indications that a large number of civilians are trapped in these towns. Mr. Annan demands that the parties take all steps to ensure that civilians are not harmed. And he also further demands the entry of the UN military observers into the town of Al-Hafa immediately.
The Supreme Court has refused to take up the cases of 7 Guantanamo Bay prisoners, despite previously ruling they have the constitutional right to challenge their detention in civilian court. The court originally affirmed the prisoners' legal right to challenge their confinement and seek their release in a landmark ruling 4 years ago today. But on Monday, the justices rejected without explanation the appeals of 7 of the 169 men currently held in the military prison. In a separate decision, the Supreme Court also rejected an appeal from the former so-called enemy combatant, Jose Padilla, to reinstate a lawsuit seeking to hold former Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld and other officials responsible for Padilla's torture. He was jailed for 43 months without charge in a Navy brig in South Carolina. He's now serving a 17-year sentence. In denying Padilla's appeal, the court let stand a federal appeals court ruling that his designation as an enemy combatant precluded him from the right to sue for alleged violations of constitutional rights, and that such cases are not entitled to judicial review. In a statement, the American Civil Liberties Union said, quote, "The Supreme Court's refusal to consider Jose Padilla's case leaves in place a blank check for government officials to commit any abuse in the name of national security, even the brutal torture of an American citizen in an American prison," unquote. We'll have more on the Supreme Court decisions after headlines. As many as 100 people are feared dead after 2 earthquakes struck a remote area in northern Afghanistan. Residents say roughly 24 houses have been swallowed up in a massive landslide of mud and rocks. The U.S. has withdrawn a negotiating team from Pakistan after failing to reach a deal with the Pakistani government over the reopening of NATO supply lines for troops in Afghanistan. The apparent stalemate is the latest sign of rising tensions between Pakistan and the United States. Last week, Defense Secretary Leon Panetta said the U.S. is losing patience with the Pakistani government over its failure to crack down on militants. Pakistan closed the supply routes to troops in Afghanistan after U.S. airstrikes killed 24 Pakistani soldiers last November. The U.S. has refused to apologize for the attacks. An unnamed U.S. official recently told the Associated Press the U.S.-Pakistan relationship is, quote, "the worst it's ever been." Ousted Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak is reportedly in stable condition after reports of a severe health crisis sparked rumors the imprisoned former leader had already died. Mubarak was said to be slipping in and out of consciousness and experiencing severe depression, and there were reports doctors at the prison hospital had used a defibrillator twice to resuscitate him Monday. The 84-year-old Mubarak was sentenced to life in prison earlier this month for his role in the killings of peaceful protesters during the uprising that ended his rule last year. His health problems come just days before a runoff presidential election between his former Prime Minister Ahmed Shafiq and the Muslim Brotherhood's candidate Mohamed Morsi. The Justice Department and Florida have each announced plans to sue the other in an escalating standoff over the state's controversial voter purge. Justice officials asked Florida last week to halt an effort to remove thousands of registered voters from the rolls. People Florida says are non-U.S. citizens. Critics say 87% of those targeted are people of color and say the purge is part of an effort to disenfranchise Democratic voters in a key election state. The Justice Department announced its lawsuit after Florida vowed to continue the crackdown, and Florida said it would bring a suit of its own over the federal government's denial of access to a citizenship database. A New York police officer has been indicted on manslaughter charges for the fatal shooting of an unarmed African-American teenager. 18-year-old Ramarley Graham was shot at close range in his grandmother's apartment February 2nd after being chased into the house by narcotics detectives. Graham was trying to empty a bag of marijuana into the toilet before the police killed him. The indicted officer has been identified as 30-year-old Richard Haste. He's expected to turn himself in on Wednesday. A trial has begun for 8 Occupy Wall Street protesters on trespassing charges stemming from their arrest at New York's Trinity Church in December. The protesters had scaled a fence onto church-owned property after Trinity refused to give them sanctuary following their eviction from Zuccotti Park at the time. The Justice Department seeking to avert a potential congressional vote on bringing contempt charges against Attorney General Eric Holder related to a probe into the controversial gun sting operation known as Fast and Furious. The operation saw U.S. agents encouraging the sale of thousands of guns to middlemen from Mexican drug cartels in an attempt to gain access to senior-level figures within Mexico's criminal organizations. Republicans have threatened to charge Holder over his refusal to hand over documents about the program. Democrats have accused Republicans of blatant political theater in targeting Holder and his staff. The CEO of the celebrated U.S. hygiene products company Dr. Bronner's Magic Soaps was arrested outside the White House Monday, protesting the U.S. ban on industrial hemp farming. David Bronner locked himself inside a steel cage along with several hemp plants that he harvested for oil.
Spend over $100,000 a year buying hemp seed oil from Canadian farmers. We've been trying over 10 years to be able to grow and purchase hemp seed oil from American farmers. And we're just getting really frustrated with Obama, who, as a state senator from Illinois, voted twice for industrial hemp cultivation, but as a president has ignored us completely. This is not a drug. This is like a poppy seed bagel. You know, the poppy seed comes from the bread seed poppy, a non-drug cultivar of the opium poppy. It's the same thing with industrial hemp. The rest of the world's moving on. Canada, China, Europe, and American farmers are just cut out.
David Bronner was detained after several hours inside the cage when police broke open the lock. For our full interview with David Bronner in our studios here at Democracy Now!, you can go to our website at democracynow.org. The Obama administration's announced Commerce Secretary John Bryson will take an immediate medical leave of absence after getting involved in 2 car crashes over the weekend. Bryson was found unconscious behind the wheel after colliding with the same car twice, then crashing into another vehicle. Aides say he suffered a seizure. And the Navy has announced a U.S. drone has crashed in a swamp in Maryland, not far from Washington, D.C. The drone is one of 5 Global Hawk aircraft used by the Navy for maritime surveillance. The crash could hinder efforts by military and law enforcement officials to use drones for domestic operations. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.